Frito. I've got about 15 minutes to get this right, so we're going to do it in one take. I'm going to give you lots of numbers, and I'm going to pat myself on the back quite a bit in this episode of Your Podcasters because, as you may know, I devour information about the podcast industry. I go to websites that no one would go to unless you're in this industry. Very boring numbers, very boring content, but very important to me. And RadioWorld.com has a very interesting story that they posted last week, the beginning of May. And the story details how the two biggest commercial radio companies, iHeart and Cumulus, and I worked for Cumulus for quite some time. Well, they're finally calling attention to the favorable trends in podcast consumption. Let me tell you something about radio. When I was in radio all the way until 2016, I spent a lot of time in management. And radio managers are constantly trying to figure out what's going to keep people from listening to my radio station. And back in the day when podcast came out, I was a very cocky radio guy, I admit it. I didn't look at the podcasters as real competition because those were the guys that couldn't get jobs in radio, to be honest with you. Those were the minor leaguers, the dudes in their mom's basement with a recorder and knew how to upload a podcast. But I did understand that anything that could keep my audience from listening to my radio station was competition. And that could mean a podcast, even if I didn't respect the podcaster. It could mean something as simple as a phone call. If someone that is driving to work decides, well, I'm going to use this time in traffic to make my phone calls for the day rather than listen to the radio, that's competition with my radio station. And I don't like that, okay? So as much as I didn't respect the hosts in the industry maybe, I did respect the podcast were a definite alternative to my radio station. And I did understand that the delivery method was much more efficient than listening to my radio station. But I also understood at the time that not too many people really knew how to download podcasts. And a lot of people, consumers, didn't want to take the time to learn it. So I wasn't too threatened by it, but I did see the possibilities. Well, fast forward 6 years. I've been in this business for about 6 years, close to 7 actually. And while the radio industry had been ignoring the power of podcasts, I, pat myself on the back, was looking at the opportunity the podcast presented because what podcast presented to me were an opportunity to basically have a radio station without having all that overhead, without needing a transmitter or a license or complying with FCC regulations or having a sales department or having all the extras that go along with the radio station. The barrier to entry was taken away because of technology, okay? Well, over the past 6-7 years, the growth in podcasting has been amazing. It's grown to the point where these huge corporations, not only can they not ignore the format anymore, they understand they need to take advantage of it. Over the course of those 7 years, since 2016, according to Edison research, the daily podcast reach has quadrupled in every demographic, not just men 25-54, not just college-age kids. Every demographic has seen 400% growth at least over the past 6 years in podcasts. The time spent listening to podcasts has increased from 26 minutes to 57 minutes. That's huge. That is huge. And as of right now, and this is something that has currently happened, the number of weekly podcast listeners has surpassed the number of Netflix subscribers. That's huge also. Over the last 2 years, just in 2 years, the number of Black and Hispanic podcast listeners has increased more than 30%. And these aren't made up numbers. These are numbers that have been compiled by some of the most well-respected research companies when it comes to media. Nielsen, Edison, Nielsen Scarborough, iHeart, Cumulus, huge names, all this research. And you can tell how excited I am because once again, it's just proving me right. And I like to be right. Critical Mass Media, another huge company, says the increase in podcast listening is actually coming from people that are reducing their time that they've spent on streaming video, streaming music, and social media. Look, there's only 24 hours in a day. So when someone spends more time listening to podcasts, it's coming from somewhere else. Well, here's where it's coming from. Streaming video, streaming music, social media, and they didn't put in radio listening. And I'm going to assume that they didn't put in radio listening because this research is geared towards radio companies so they can see the power of podcasts. So I kind of understand that. But what they did include in their research is Edison Research and Nielsen Scarborough show that over half of all time spent with spoken word content occurs through podcasts, not radio stations, podcasts. That means, for example, Dave Ramsey, who is a radio superstar in spoken word radio. If you haven't heard him, he's a financial guy that gives very common sense financial advice. More people are listening to his podcasts and getting his content through the podcast than through the radio. That number has doubled over the past 5 years, and it's going to continue to grow. And if you listen to podcasts now, you kind of understand what I'm saying, because once you have learned how to download the podcast and once you get comfortable with it, it's a much more efficient way to consume your radio. So these numbers are going to continue to grow. These big corporations, these radio corporations, and you can hear it right now, what they're doing. They're promoting their own podcasts. They're producing their own podcast. They're promoting them. They are finally on board. And that's what I want to tell you. You still have the opportunity to be on the ground floor of this industry that is literally exploding right in front of us. Okay? And you can get in very economically efficiently, if that's a phrase, economically efficiently. Think about that. It's very efficient to get a podcast. Look, I'm charging very little compared to radio stations. You can advertise on these podcasts for very little compared to what you can do in radio. And I'm not saying that radio's competition. I'm just saying that these things are powerful. Podcasts are powerful. The listeners listen. They're engaged. I've known it for quite a while. Pat myself on the back. And finally, these big corporations are getting a clue and they're understanding that they need to be in on it and they need to expand and invest in their own podcasts. So if you need more proof, I don't know what's better proof than a huge corporation deciding we're going to join the competition. They looked at podcast as competition, and now they look at podcast as we need to take advantage of it. It's one of those, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And that's what's going on. And they're doing a smart thing. And you need to do a smart thing. Find a way to take advantage of this exploding market in podcasting. Feel free to shoot me a text, 214-250-1321. Shoot me an email at mark@freedonation.com, or just go to my website and book a free consultation, www.freedonation.com.